So good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here today, back to the RIEL Seminar Series, session number 5. I hope you had a good break during Easter and refreshed your energies. Today we are proceeding only online, so we are aiming for a 40-45 minutes talk, followed by questions and answers at the end. So please keep yourself muted and preferably turn off your camera while our speaker is presenting. And later on, we're gonna get your questions. You could either raise the hand with the emoji or use the chat box, and we'll be reading the questions to our speaker. So we wish to pay our respects to the Larakia people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. We also acknowledge all First Nation peoples across the lands on which we live and work, and pay our respects to elders both past and present. And having said that, I'm glad to have here today Dr. Noel Preece, a leading scientist in the Spectacle Flying Fox recovery team. He's an adjunct professor, associate professor at the James Cook University, and also here at the Charles Darwin University. Previously, during 2009 to 2014, he was a partner investigator in RIEL, I believe, in CDU, and he's a conservation ecologist with expertise in northern and central Australian ecosystems, mainly dealing with fauna, vegetation, fire, pests, carbon sequestration, among many other topics. And he's also actively working with Biome 5. And today, the topic, as you know, it's spectacle flying foxes. So I'm pretty sure Noel has many experiences to share, and we are very happy to hear. Thank you, Noel, for volunteering, and you're good to go.
Great. Thank you very much, Raphael, and good morning, everyone. I'll start straight away. My talk is today about the spectacle flying fox, which is quite a restricted but very important species found in the wet tropics. It's an endangered species. I've been convener on the science subcommittee for the spectacle flying fox recovery team for the last 4 years, and have done quite a bit of work on getting a recovery plan written, and I'll get into that shortly. In the wet tropics, sorry, I'll start with an acknowledgement of country. The spectacle flying fox covers the country of about 30 or so indigenous nations, mostly wet tropics, rainforest Aboriginal peoples. I live and work on Nadjon country in the tablelands of the wet tropics. I have worked closely with quite a number of people on the recovery team for the last 4 years, and I acknowledge them and their support and help and their enthusiasm, which I'll get to a bit later. In the wet tropics, North Queensland, we have around 40 species of bats, mostly microbats, but there are several species of flying foxes in the Pteropodidae group. There are 4 species of Pteropus. One is the spectacle flying fox, which is the topic of my conversation today. Then there's the little red, which is somewhat smaller, but very, very widespread across the eastern and northern parts of Australia, and it's common in the territory as well. The grey-headed flying fox, which is a southeastern and southern species. It's mainly found in southeast Queensland and south. It's vulnerable. Black flying fox, which you would well know, is right across northern Australia and down the east coast for quite a distance. They do differ in appearance. The grey-headed is very clearly a grey-headed animal. The little red is quite distinctly red and small, and very noticeable difference in terms of the way they roost in trees. They cluster very, very closely together and cause branches to break and so on. The two other species, about the same size, the black flying fox and the spectacled flying fox, and mostly you can tell the difference quite easily, but sometimes the black flying fox has a golden or rufous ruff around the back of its neck, and sometimes pale colouring around the eyes to look a bit like spectacled flying fox. And if you're not careful, you could mistake them if there were one or two animals in amongst spectacled flying foxes, but mostly they're quite distinctive animals. There are several other pteropodids in the region, all of which do similar things to the Pteropus genus. The northern blossom bat, which you find in the Northern Territory as well, is the tube-nosed bat, and the bare-backed fruit bat, which is confined mostly to the Cape York area, northern Cape York area. Distinguishing features of the spectacled flying fox are that golden mane. It's very distinctive in most animals, and then the spectacle is named after the pale fur around the eyes, which makes it quite a distinctive animal in most cases. Can't always tell what species they are when they're flying, because they're at a distance. They're usually backed by very bright skies, so it makes it difficult to identify sometimes. The range of the spectacled flying fox includes the eastern parts of the north coast and south coast of Papua New Guinea. And there are two subspecies, that's Pteropus conspicillatus chrysalcon and the conspicillatus, which is the one found on the mainland. The mainland species is assumed to cross over the Torres Strait towards the southeastern parts of New Guinea, but there are no specific records of it. It's just because they're the same subspecies that we think they probably interbreed and cross that open water. Certainly the black flying fox does cross that open water, but we don't have records of the specky doing that. This is the total range of the spectacled flying fox. It ranges from south around Mackay and up to the Iron Range, Mackelwraith Range in the northeast of the Cape York area. But it's restricted in distribution into two or maybe three main populations on the mainland. The Iron Range one, which is in the north, up around here, it's a poorly studied population. It's believed to contain a few thousand animals various times, but we don't have any monitoring up there. We don't have much or any research going on up there. The main population is in the main wet tropics, and it's distributed within those areas, mostly on the coast, but also on the tablelands and some of the high country. And I'll get into some interesting aspects of their behaviour and distribution shortly. The spectacled flying fox is a medium-sized, sometimes called large flying fox. It grows to 120 to 240 mil, that's 24 centimetres. And they can weigh up to 1,000 grams in the males, and the females usually up to about 800 grams. The maximum age in the wild is around 13 years that's been recorded, but we suspect that they can probably live longer. There's some recent work done by Matt and Mana, who had recaptured a flying fox, a grey-headed flying fox that had been released some 18 years earlier, and it was still healthy and alive. So these animals were very, very closely related, could also live for that long. They don't start reproducing until around 2 or 3 years, and they only have one pup per year, which certainly has implications for their recovery. The generation time is about 5 to 8 years, and the annual mortality is reasonably high. It's about 35%. Without disturbance, it could increase at about 0.04% per year. That's 4 per 100 per year. That's from studies done by Sam Fox and Dave Westcott and co. But with the presence of disturbances, which we do get quite regularly here, as you would well know, cyclones can knock them out quite dramatically. And over the last almost 20 years of study, the population has declined at a steady rate of about minus 0.12 per year. They're extremely important to the rainforests because they're one of the few species of animal that will move fruits and pollen across the landscape. They do travel quite long distances, up to over 100 kilometers per night from their roosting sites, their daytime roosting sites. But in general, in the order of 20, 25 kilometers or closer. But they do eat a lot of nectar from native species, particularly in the eucalyptus group, but also lots of native fruits, and they eat them. They chew them by pushing their tongues against the roof of the mouth and extracting the juice. But in the process, they also swallow seeds, and so quite a few seeds are carried in their gut. And sometimes, and this is an important aspect, sometimes they will carry fruits in their mouths to other places when there's enough competition to fight over a piece of fruit, and that has implications for its decline. There are over 100 species of fruits known to be eaten by the spectacled flying fox, and that includes obviously leaves and flowers and nectar and fruits, but it also eats our favourite fruits. So it has become a problem. It was a problem recognised in the early 1900s when Europeans moved in and took over a lot of the country and started planting fruits and other things. And so it became a problem then, and still a problem now. It also has causes problems in distributing some of the native fruits, and it's not just guava and wild tobacco. It's quite a number of others as well, because they're fleshy, they're tasty, they're nutritious, and so on. And one of the problems we have is a feedback with wild tobacco, because it's one of their favourite fruits, but it also harbours paralysis ticks, and paralysis ticks cause paralysis in spectacled flying foxes quite frequently, and it's one of the biggest killers and causes of animals going into care. The paralysis tick is quite prevalent, and it certainly knocks out a population growth because of the loss of particularly young animals. In the early 2000s, there were some 18,000 spectacled flying foxes electrocuted in south of Cairns, in one farm, in fact, and that was not like cattle fencing where you get a pulse. These were fully electrified fences that wires that went over the fruit crops, and that killed in many instances quite a number of flying foxes, in the order of thousands, probably tens of thousands. But one of the events caused a legal case which became the first legal case under the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. It became the flying fox case. And the case was won, and it prevented further damage or injury to flying foxes using electrocution. It was still permitted to shoot the flying foxes when they came into the orchards, but that case that was won prevented further electrocution in these very large numbers. But there are other threats as well, such as the one on the right in the image there. That's a grey-headed flying fox, but it's caught in a fruit tree net, and there's been a lot of work done on getting better designs and better materials for fruit tree protection, including much smaller gaps, so that they don't get tangled, so that the bats come in for life and bounce off, basically. and that's been worked at for the last 20 years or so. There are other threats as well, of course. But bats get caught in flying in barbed wire, and there's been a very strong movement to introduce clean, non-barbed wire for a top strand in cattle paddocks. And the reason that seems to work is because the bats come flying over the particularly ridges and sense the fence, but usually too late, and they get caught in that top barb. So there's been a barbless safe twist wire developed. There are other threats as well. There's quite a few, including that one on the left there with electrocution. And you'll see an image on the right there with a bat that was a tolga with a hole in its wing. A hole that size is not really going to knock them out of flight, but much larger, and they can get torn and become irreparable. So what's the problem with flying foxes? Well, as people call them ugly. I think they're gorgeous, but that's personal, I suppose. They do have a strong smell around camps because they eat a lot of fruit and it ferments, so they do smell strongly. Some people don't like it. Some don't really care. There was also the threat of disease, and that's been well and truly analysed, and we know what causes and symptoms are and how to prevent disease transfer to humans and to other animals like horses, which are the vector for Hendra, which is quite deadly, but most horses that are associated with flying foxes these days are vaccinated because the Hendra actually affects the bats as well. Perceptions go back a long time. This is a couple of 100 years ago, where devils were imagined with wings that just look like bats, and it's one of those sort of cultural things that still pervades. There's still a thinking to some degree that they're evil, dangerous, and nasty creatures. So the spectacled flying fox can certainly destroy agricultural crops, but it's not universal. In discussion with the bat hospital at Tolga, the owner there is Jenny McLean, and she pointed out that the people she deals with frequently, nearly every day, a lot of them are crop farmers, and the mangoes, for instance, mostly mangoes are picked green, and the flying foxes don't touch them while they're green because they're not ready to eat. Whereas other fruits like lychees and longans and so on are very readily taken by flying foxes. So there's a bit of a difference. It's quite clear now that the fear of contracting diseases from spectacled flying foxes it's a bit of a scare. And when coronavirus was around so long ago, the flying foxes were immediately blamed for being one of the carriers of that coronavirus. It doesn't carry coronavirus, but they do foul footpaths and destroy cars, geoco and poo in your pool, and they do have smells that some people find objectionable. They can be quite noisy, especially when they're coming back to their roosts, especially when they're maternity roosts and the mothers are returning after a night foraging to find their babies and yelling out, "Where's my baby?" Quite noisily in bat speak. And so they can be quite noisy, particularly late in the morning or early in the morning before sunup. They also die in some numbers when they fly into buildings, particularly in cities and towns. They also can obstruct development, and because they are now an endangered species, they can cause developments to be stopped or delayed because of that circumstance. Just wanted to mention that one of the most alarming diseases that has caused a lot of the fear of spectacled flying foxes and other flying foxes is this Hendra virus, which, as you probably know, killed a number of vets a number of years ago. Not so long ago, actually, but about 2014, 2012 period. The Hendra virus is carried by bats. It doesn't seem to affect them too much, if at all, but it is transferred to horses when flying foxes are camping or roosting above a horse paddock, and the horses graze the grass and pick up the virus. And from there, it's transferred to humans. A flying fox won't transfer Hendra virus directly to a human, so there's no evidence of that. One of the reasons that Hendra virus became an issue is because of the pressures we're putting on the bats, the expanding human populations, the increased urbanisation, and that urban interface between flying fox camps and where humans live. So that's increased the contact, which is not uncommon with wildlife because of the pressures we're putting on them. And it's become a problem because it's altering the ecological niche of this Pteropus species and may modulate the spillover risk where horses are not vaccinated. It also increases the potential for humans to say, get rid of them. And that is a real problem. It's a recurrent problem that we who are working with flying foxes face all the time. So apart from its dangers and the problems it causes to humans, it's also a keystone species. As I mentioned, it disperses fruits across the wet tropics in quite large numbers of bats. There used to be over 300,000 flying around the country. And other species do move fruits, but none of them move in the same way and distances that these spectacled flying foxes move. So as we see the climate change and the phenology of plants changing, these might become critical species in the survival of the wet tropics in a range of species which have very few other means of fruit being distributed. It certainly has cultural, spiritual and totemic significance to rainforest Aboriginal peoples, which we have been working with, but haven't been able to get very far because of a number of issues that have come up, including the issue of cost, because Indigenous people who are interested usually have too many other issues to deal with to be able to voluntarily afford time. There was a recovery plan in place from 2010 to 2020. It expired. During that time, it moved from vulnerable to endangered. And that was during the term of a recovery plan. And that's quite disturbing. Because it's such an important species across its range, if the numbers drop, then the animals don't move as far when they're feeding and foraging. They might still move to mate and so on, but they don't move as far as they otherwise would when they're feeding. And that means the fruits are not carried as much because there's not as much competition for those fruits in the trees. And so that decline over that the last 20 years or so has meant that there is a risk of some trending towards functional extinction. The population decline has been alarming. 75% of the population disappeared over 14 years of monitoring. And remember, this is during the recovery plan's operation. Even before 2010, the species lost about a third of its breeding sites. They were destroyed for urban and agricultural development. And yet there was no action done under the recovery plan for the period that it was in existence, except monitoring, and that's virtually monitoring towards extinction, which is quite disturbing. Even during the term of the plan, between 2013 and 2020, about 3/4 of the roost trees in a nationally important camp were destroyed with the approval of the federal and state governments and under an as of right authority with Cairns Regional Council. Those roosts were destroyed legally, but that has meant that the Cairns CBD population has almost gone. It's been harassed for the last 3 or 4 years, to the point of the animals just not wanting to go back there, but it's cost a lot of money for the council to do that, to move them on in the few trees that are left. And I'll show you that in the next slide. But the other important thing is that despite the wet tropics covering, I don't know, 350,000 hectares, 86% of the roosts fall outside the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area, which means that they're all in urban and rural and agricultural areas. And so the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area is actually not protecting their where they camp, where they live, where they roost and mate and have their young, which is something that a lot of people are quite astonished about. But because you think, well, you've got a World Heritage Area, why aren't they there? Well, they don't seem to want to. And after almost 20 years of monitoring, there have been very, very few camps of flying foxes found within intact forest, particularly in intact rainforest. But there are some new studies coming up to find out what happens when the roosts disperse in the dry seasons. So that's the population decline over the last 20 years almost, and it's still going down as far as we know. The Cairns CBD area on the left of that image I just pulled up, that was the trees around the central business district of Cairns. The ones in the middle, all the red crosses are the trees that have gone, and the trees that are left are the ones just around the Cairns Library. And there's a team of people goes there during the breeding season when they congregate to have their babies and raise their young. They've been harassed out of that camp using ethical guidelines, of course, but they've been harassed out of that camp for the last 4 years. And the problem is not only that they're being harassed and they're disrupting their breeding, but it means that those bats, and it was a much bigger camp, was in the order of tens of thousands, have distributed and dispersed to other areas around Cairns, which means that more people are getting disturbed. So the recovery plan, there were 25 odd recovery actions identified. Virtually none of them were implemented, and that's partly the lack of a recovery team at the time. There was one formed in about 2009, 2010, and it just disappeared. There's no record of it. The plan actually identified lots of organisations who could, should, or would do the work to actions that are needed to help this species recover. Remember, it was only vulnerable at the time. It was when the plan was implemented, but it's been become endangered since. There was some incidental work done around protecting animals, including the fencing I was talking about, getting rid of barbed wire, putting better netting over the trees. But overall, there was almost nothing done except that monitoring, which pointed out the fact that they're actually in trouble. I move now on to some of the threats that the spectacled flying fox is facing. It's quite a vulnerable species, and you may know that that flying foxes and other species in the tropics tend to be a bit more vulnerable to heat extremes. Not so in more temperate regions, but certainly in the wet tropics or the tropics, because their temperature range tends to be a bit lower, and so extreme temperatures can be more lethal. And spectacled flying foxes, I should say, speckies, we call them speckies because it's shorter. And they die from extreme heat above 42 degrees Celsius. And we lost, as I mentioned, 75% of the population over almost 2 decades. Then in 2018, late November, early December of 2018, another 23,000, or almost a third of the remaining population, died from one extreme heat event. And that was after the population crash paper was published by CSIRO, Dave Westcott and co. Some of the temperatures reached 42.9 degrees, and temperatures recording in the roosts were up to 48 degrees Celsius, which is quite considerable. We would die at that temperature as well. And some of the work that's been done by Camilo Lopez and co-authors has shown that the temperatures within inside the colony can be much hotter than outside, and could be 10 degrees above the average, and it was 10 degrees above average on the 27th of November 2018. And some of the city sites were up to 8 degrees higher, warmer than the Bureau of Meteorology site at Cairns Airport. So we need to have much better modelling across the range. This extreme heat event is likely to happen again. What it was a heat trough moving across from the west, and over a few days before the heat event in Cairns, it just moved right across North Queensland, and reached some quite extreme temperatures. It was disturbing in that in 2018 it was a neutral year, whereas in El Nino and La Nina years, the circumstances can be quite different. So in the neutral year, we had this extreme event. It's really hard to predict, and the reason I'm sort of hesitating is that there are quite a few papers out that predict different paths, depending on how the climate change works in the wet tropics. And it can be a really difficult thing to figure out what to do, because La Nina and El Nino and the neutral years can have quite different effects, and not all predictable because we haven't seen it before, because they're new. But as you can see from these maps, that there were some extreme temperatures right up and down the coast. And so in a way, there was nowhere for the flying foxes to go. Remember, the range is quite restricted. The map on the right shows the extreme event, and it shows where those high temperatures were. And the green lines are the rough approximation of the main populations of the two populations of the spectacled flying fox, and they fall right within the that heat wave severity category. It's something that we've started to realise, is that I mean, it's quite alarming to see all those images of these extreme heat events, which can wipe out very large numbers and could wipe out a whole population without too much trouble. But it's not necessarily so. And this more refined map from the same sources, the Bureau of Meteorology, shows that the temperatures within Cairns itself were actually quite a bit higher, up to 4 degrees higher than further up the tablelands and further south, and up towards the Cowan and Iron Range areas. So not all animals are equally affected. And where I live on the tablelands, we had probably had temperatures which were below the lethal limit. Well, we certainly did, because not many animals died up here, but there were some. So not all is lost, but what we need to do is to do some mapping and planning about how we can overcome this. Now, I mentioned that the roosts, and this is part of the story on this, mentioned the roosts are often in urban areas, and these are a map of part of the Cairns Central swamp area. And I've been mapping all these roosts across its range, and found that the average size is about 30 hectares, but the median size is about 8. And each of those roosts is used at different times for reasons we don't understand. And I don't even use the Cairns botanical gardens, and yet that's right next to some other major camps which are used all the time. So we don't understand what that's all about. And this is another image of where these camps lie. This is actually the location where all those 23,000 animals died. 15,000 in one camp, and the other 8 in adjacent camps around Edmonton area. So what we're looking at is trying to build a heat model, and we've been looking at modeling each of those camps, doing the vegetation analysis, which surprisingly hasn't been done, and to describe the species, the structure, what the threats are, what the understory is, and those sorts of factors which need to be done so that we can work out what we should do with each of these camps. Because obviously there's no point in trying to manage or restore a camp that is right in the middle of a predicted or known heat event, such as around Edmonton. So it's more important it's quite important to work out where we should take action so that our actions are not wasted. And so we're trying to do some work on that. And Susan Lawrence and Andrew Krockenberger, I think, are getting some funding from NESP to do some of that heat modelling, which is really important stuff to do. Now, the losses numbers I've mentioned already, but it's just worth reinforcing. The extinction or reduction to functional extinction can cause major problems for other species such as trees. And so we need to be cognizant of this fact, and there's been research already done to show that the loss of seed dispersers is likely to have an effect. McCaney et al. Said by 2100. Well, I think it's probably happening now. It is progressive. It's not suddenly at 2100. It'll happen. It's going to be happening even now. And they also found that there'd be a decline of 40% of seed dispersal distances by 2100. That's really important for the spectacled flying fox. And because if the numbers do drop and they're not moving as much, then they're not carrying food around. So what are we doing about this? Well, in 2020, we established this recovery team. We've got about 25 active members, most or many of them volunteers. We had to fight to get the spectacled flying fox, which at that stage was already known to be an endangered species, as one of the 110 priority species. You wouldn't think you'd have to fight that, but we did. We had to advocate, and we finally won the case to allow it to have a priority listing. And then we had to fight to allow it to have a recovery plan. And now we've drafted a recovery plan. We did it voluntarily. It's now under review by the recovery team and some external experts contracted to do reviews. And we hope that it'll go to the Threatened Species Scientific Committee in May, so that it can be sent out for public consideration and discussion, and get it listed as a registered recovery plan. We're also improving the database of roost records across the range of the spectacled flying fox. And for that, we're using citizen scientists. We're also doing a lot of advocating to federal and Queensland governments. One of the citizen science activities is to develop or use a commercial data recording app, such as BioCollect or iNaturalist or something like that, to enable citizens to give us some feedback on where these flying foxes are. And obviously, there's a number of things we have to make sure we do. And the image on the right there is created by Kate Cole, who's not a flying fox expert. She worked out how to count them by doing clusters, as any good ecologist would do. But she worked this out from first principles. So my view is that citizen scientists can actually contribute to this, and it won't substitute for the population modelling, but it will improve our understanding of where they are across the landscape. So we need to do a number of things. Obviously, modelling the extreme heat events, movements of the spectacled flying foxes across the landscape. We're trying to get lots and lots of collars on because we don't know where they go, especially during the dry season. We need to map and describe all the roosts. We need to build those thermal profiles and work out better what the heat tolerances of bats are, and therefore where we put action to help them survive. We don't actually know much about what foods they consume. I've developed a list based on other people's work, the 108 species, but we suspect that there's probably a lot more than that, probably hundreds of species that they eat, depending on when the fruits are available and the leaves and the pollen are available. We need to do more work on Hendra and toxoplasmosis, trypanosomiasis, and so on. We also need to restart the monitoring. The funding from the Federal Department of Environment stopped in 2022 for the National Flying Fox Monitoring Program. And we think and hope that monitoring is being taken over by people in this region, so that we can continue to work out what the population is doing. And of course, this is one of the most important measures of the outcomes from actions under the recovery plan. Without population modelling, we don't even know whether our actions are actually working or not. We need to obviously identify unknown camps, and some of the work that's been done by CSIRO for Department of Environment and Science has shown that the animals do move quite some distances, and they've got different classes of camps. The bats do use mangroves and paperbark swamps during the dry seasons, but come together in urban camps. One of the definitions of a flying fox camp is a place where flying foxes go to disturb people. So we're hoping to get some thermal drones up for counting, improving counting, and to get some more GPS tags and collars and PTTs and so on to work out where they go. On the right there's a thermal image taken of some flying foxes in a mangrove swamp down east of Cairns. And if we can use drones to improve the counting accuracy, precision, and getting more camps counted, then we're on a winner. We have to work out how to do some of these things, which I talked about before, about providing buffers so that we select camps that are used regularly and can be managed better, that are not going to be in those extreme heat events locations. Need to keep up the work on the devil's rope, which is barbed wire. We need to do more work on controlling wild tobacco, because that's where tick paralysis is sourced. And we need to improve community knowledge about flying foxes, so that the fear is reduced and it's no longer a main problem. We still need to manage bats, flying foxes, but the fear is one of the factors that tends to drive complaints. Getting towards the end, but one of the things that I've realised in looking at many recovery plans, in trying to draft this recovery plan for the spec, is that the recovery plans that worked all had champions, and that is it's one of those funny things that, I mean, you can have great ideas, but without a champion, and we all know champions. They're the ones that actually get things going, and sometimes that can be irritating, sometimes that can be pushing, but they are working all the time on getting better outcomes for the species and ecosystems they're looking at and working on. And the recovery team we have now has champions. It's got quite a range of people who attend most, if not all, meetings. As I mentioned, there's over 25 members, and everybody's doing their bit, and it's really important that we continue to that. And for the local community, we're trying to develop this using smartphone apps to be able to identify camps that are being used and how and what sort of numbers are in them, and make sure that we get the identifications of the flying foxes done properly. And that's the end of my talk. So if you have any questions, please ask them.
Great talk, Noel. Very complete. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Noel. Could you, it was a great talk, really appreciate it. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by these buffer zones for the thermal refugia? How do you make the bats go there, even if you identify these places that are a bit cooler?
Bats are free-willed beings, unfortunately.
Yeah.
They don't go where we want them to. The term that used to be used was we relocate flying foxes, but that is clearly nonsense, because they go where they want to go. So disturbance just disturbs them and sends them to some other camp, and that's where some of the issues have come up. Many of the issues have come up because of the urban nature of this problem. So that any disturbance of a camp that's causing problems creates problems elsewhere, and sometimes greater problems. So the camps become smaller, and they have more effect on residents. The buffers, it's a concept that's sort of embryonic, and there's been voluntary work done by the Bat Society on repairing some of the camps that are known, but we don't know whether that's going to work or not. And trying to create buffers means that we have to have a thought process about where these animals are, why they're using these camps that they're using, particularly for the breeding ones, and work on camps, the patches of vegetation basically, that are likely to be outside the extreme heat event zones. So it's a buffer in the concept of identifying camp locations that are more suitable, that are actually used already, so that we don't waste our time on the ones that are more likely to get those heat events. Was, given money, and we should work on all of them, but we know that resources are going to be limited, or they're always limited. So we need to focus and target on these areas. So it's buffer in a fairly loose concept. It's really selecting camps that are outside that extreme heat envelope. If we can model it, we don't have as much data as we would like, but that's the way life is.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
So I would have a question. What would you say in terms of forest structure and composition, and eventually just the tree structure? So like if you in a certain area, the roost area, as you mentioned, or these forest fragments that are habitat for the flying foxes, like do you have any association? Is there evidence already that older trees can support more flying foxes or things like that? Would that be useful?
It's a very good question, Raphael, and one we have been asking. Why do the flying foxes go to places they go to? we don't have any hard data on the structure or species of the places they camp or roost, but we do have some knowledge of some forests that have been planted between 10 and 20 years ago, which are providing roosting and camping habitat for flying foxes. So they don't need to be old, but they do need to have some sort of structure. And Camila Lopez, who's just completing her PhD as we speak, has been looking at some of the aspects of that. She's been working under Susan Lawrence and trying to work out what some of those elements are for some of the coastal plains species camps that are being used. But we need to do a lot more on that, because when we look at the camps, that they all have different species and different structures, and we don't actually know what makes them valuable or important, why they ignore patches of vegetation that are quite adjacent to other patches that to us look the same. We don't know why they move. Is it because there's too many parasites coming in, or it's getting too crowded, or it's getting too smelly because they've been pooing everywhere? We just don't know. We don't know why they move on. And I've got some very interesting records from the Port Douglas region of two major camps which have been occupied, as far as we know, for at least a couple of decades. And one of them in the northern part might be used for 3, 5, 8 years in a row, in large numbers, 50,000 animals, and then it's abandoned. The following year, the southern camp, which is in the irritating zone because it's right amongst dwellings and resorts at Port Douglas, they might stay there for the next 3 to 5 to 8 years or something like that. We don't know whether they're the same animals, but we do know that they're congregating and aggregating in that other location. And we simply don't know why. Why would they just suddenly move and stay at the new camp for that period of time, 5 to 8 years, or maybe even longer? And then they might suddenly move back. So there's been terms bandied around like it's an abandoned camp. But I've got records now going back several decades to show that abandoned camps they're not abandoned, they're just not used for a while. So they might be really important for reasons we simply don't understand. And when we're dealing with an endangered species, which is in real trouble, I mean, as I pointed out, another major heat event could knock out another third or half of the population quite easily, and they are coming. We don't know why they moved from those camps for what reasons. And so we need to really, think this sort of thing through and take the best actions we can as quickly as possible. One of the things that has been interesting to observe is that a couple of the camps were planted specifically for flying foxes, for this spectacle flying fox, using fruit trees, and they're actually used now. So that might work. We don't know whether it'll work or not, but it might. But if it's a camp in fruit trees, those fruits are going to be gone extremely quickly. They won't be there for the fruits after the first day or two. They'll be there for other reasons. So maybe we can attract them to those planted camps with lots of fruit trees that are suitable for speckies. And then they become established camps. And established camps have started because of captive populations where they're being rehabilitated, and other batches have come in and stayed around. So that can happen too. So we need to work out all these tactics to try to improve their survival. And it goes back to Keith's question as well, that how do we create these buffers if we can't tell the bats where to go and they obey? So we might need to work out ways of creating more attractive places for them to go in less vulnerable areas, from particularly from heat events.
Thank you. Any other questions? Not yet. Well, just in case, could monitor some of the forest structure or the tree structure in certain places with terrestrial LiDAR technology, so laser technology, digitizing the trees or the forests. And yeah, you could get a full picture of what's going on structurally wise. And,
Yeah, we're certainly trying to do that, using either LiDAR, which is, at the moment still fairly expensive, or even point clouds from thermal or other images. RGB is sufficient for some point clouds, and you could develop a structural model, but it takes time and money, and there's been no funding for this recovery plan or recovery team to date. And as I mentioned, even the necessary monitoring of the population has been defunded, so it's really hard to get money. It's not. I mean, you can do so much for free, but you can't do it all. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
But hopefully we get there.
Yeah.
All right. So I don't see any other question. No, but I think people appreciated it pretty much. It was really a full picture, very well explained. Thanks a lot for sharing all this knowledge and experiences with us. If no one has another comment, we could conclude for today.
Okay,
And,
thank you.
yeah. All right. Thank you, Noel. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.